The bell at Savannah's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist rang out, as if each chime announced something momentous was about to happen. Light streamed through the stained glass windows and tinted the floor with gold and red, reflecting on the attentive faces of business people, politicians, and socialites. It was the most anticipated wedding of the year. Ethan Hollis, heir to the Hollis family's port empire, was to marry Blair Whitcomb, daughter of one of Atlanta's most powerful families. The Saki gossip columns were already calling it the perfect union of wealth and influence, a spectacle worthy of remembrance. But amid the luxury and the soft organ music, there was a presence that clashed with it all. In the first pew, dressed in a simple, understated dress, sat Maya Reed, Ethan's ex-wife. Many whispered, surprised by her boldness in appearing there. Others looked at her with disdain, as if she were merely an inconvenient shadow from the past. But Maya remained serene, her chin held high, not allowing anyone to see her tremble. Inside, however, her heart pounded, knowing she was entering a field where everyone was waiting to witness her defeat. When the celebrant gave Ethan the floor for the vows, what was expected was a sweeping declaration of love for his new wife. But Ethan chose venom over tenderness. Looking out at the audience with a cold smile, he raised the microphone and said, "Before I promise my love to the woman of my life, I need to thank you. Thank you to the one who taught me what marriage shouldn't be like. Maya, you were just a rehearsal, a failed rehearsal that prepared me to experience true love with Blair." The crowd's murmur echoed like a wave inside the cathedral. Some laughed, others looked at each other in shock. Blair, embarrassed, tried to keep her smile frozen, while Maya remained as still as if she were made of marble. Inside, Ethan's every word was like a blade, but she wouldn't give him the pleasure of seeing her pain. Ethan, satisfied, seemed to relish the public humiliation he had just inflicted. It was then that the church doors burst open. The echo filled the room, and everyone turned to see who dared interrupt the ceremony. A court official entered with firm steps, carrying a briefcase. His uniform gleamed in the light from the stained glass windows, and his every step made the guests hold their breath. As he reached the altar, he faced Ethan and spoke in a deep voice. "Mr. Hollis, I apologize for the interruption, but I have a court order." The groom frowned in irritation, but the officer gave him no room to argue. He turned to the audience and announced, "Ms. Maya Reed, you are summoned to appear immediately in Chatham County Probate Court. This is for the reading of a confidential addendum to the will of the late Leon Hollis." A shock rippled through the church. Leon Hollis, the family patriarch, had died 3 months earlier, and everyone believed his will had already been read. The announcement seemed impossible. Why would an ex-wife be involved in a secret document belonging to the man who had founded the empire? A buzz filled the guests. Cell phones were raised to record, reporters rushed to send messages, and the wedding that was supposed to be a spectacle of love suddenly became a stage of suspense. Maya stood slowly. Her simple dress contrasted with the luxurious surroundings, but at that moment, every step she took seemed to weigh more than the gold glittering on Blair's jewelry. All eyes were fixed on her, some filled with contempt, others with curiosity, and a few with silent admiration. Ethan tried to intervene, but the officer repeated the order firmly, and his ex-wife walked toward a future no one could predict. Hours later, back in the courtroom, the mood was different. The dark wood walls and heavy silence gave the room an air of inevitable judgment. Maya sat before Judge Lila McPherson, with lawyers and Hollis family members occupying the benches. Behind her, the document brought by the officer was handed over, still sealed with the court seal. The judge, serious, announced, "This is a confidential addendum to Leon Hollis's will, kept confidential until this moment." She broke the seal with a silver letter opener. Her eyes began to scan the lines, and as she read, her expression changed. The air in the room grew thick, as if everyone was suffocating with anticipation. When she finished reading, she looked up, took a deep breath, and declared, "This document determines that control of Hollis Maritime and Logistics will be transferred to..." A murmur erupted in the room. Ethan stood abruptly, Blair clapped her hand over her mouth in despair, and everyone present waited for the revelation. The name hadn't yet been spoken, but everyone knew that this sentence was about to turn the entire family's fate upside down. Savannah seemed to breathe history in every cobblestone street, and it was in this setting that Ethan Hollis and Maya Reed's relationship began years earlier. Maya didn't come from a wealthy family. The daughter of a mechanic and an elementary school teacher, she grew up in the humble Starland district, where dreams were bigger than the old houses lining the narrow streets. Ethan, on the other hand, was the opposite. Heir to a fortune built over generations, educated at expensive schools, and with access to everything he desired from an early age. Fate, however, brought their paths together that seemed so distant. They met during a seminar at Georgia State University. Maya, dedicated and hard-working, had secured a partial scholarship to study business administration while working at a coffee shop near campus. Ethan, on the other hand, was there to represent the family business in a lecture on port logistics. Between exchanged glances and quick exchanges, something unexpected emerged. Ethan was captivated by Maya's sincerity, so different from the women accustomed to flattering him out of self-interest. She, in turn, saw in him not a powerful heir, but a young man who, behind his confident pose, seemed to harbor a quiet loneliness. Their first meetings were discreet, walks along the Savannah riverfront, simple cafes instead of fancy dinners. Gradually, their feelings intensified, and Ethan began to move away from his playboy image to live with her. When they announced their engagement, the Hollis family's reaction was shock. Leon Hollis, the patriarch, never hid his skepticism about his future daughter-in-law, but to the surprise of many, he treated Maya with respect and even praised her determination. To him, there was something about the young woman that evoked the essence of strength, something that surnames and fortunes couldn't buy. The wedding was modest, held on Tybee Island, overlooking the sea with only a few guests nearby. While Maya smiled with emotion at the simplicity of the ceremony, Ethan seemed pleased to defy elite expectations. For a time, they lived happily ever after. She accompanied him to smaller events. He attended dinners at her modest home, and there was an unlikely balance. But this balance would not last. As Ethan rose within the family empire, the judgmental gaze intensified. At high society dinners in Savannah, Maya was the target of underhanded comments and cruel comparisons. She strove to carry herself elegantly, but with each false smile, she felt more out of place. Blair Whitcomb, already in Ethan's circle by then, made it clear that Maya would never fit in. The society columns began publishing malicious articles, and Ethan's childhood friends joined the chorus of claims that their union was nothing more than a youthful mistake. Despite the difficulties, there was someone who seemed to truly believe in her: Leon Hollis. The elderly patriarch, with a practical outlook on life, saw in Maya the strength his son lacked. Often, in private meetings, he would confide that the young woman reminded him of his own deceased wife. These words were like small beacons for Maya, who clung to them amidst the sea of hostility. Leon not only respected her, but also offered her advice on how to deal with the pressure of living under the weight of such an influential family name. Over time, however, the marriage began to fracture. Ethan increasingly prioritized business and public image. His absences became frequent, and the long silences on nights at home became unbearable. Maya, once so confident, began to feel the weight of being with someone who seemed ashamed of her. Arguments became inevitable, and what had once been love began to turn into resentment. The divorce came quickly, fueled by a scandal carefully fueled by rumors circulating behind the scenes in the city. Maya left the marriage without demanding anything, only with the dignity of someone who knew that money wouldn't restore her peace. This was the past she carried with her when she stood in church that day, summoned to court. She wasn't just an ex-wife humiliated in front of everyone. She was the woman who, years before, had dared to love someone outside her reality, who had paid the price of rejection, and who now found herself unexpectedly called back to the center of the Hollis family story, as if fate had decided to open a new page no one had foreseen. The video of the humiliation at the altar spread through Savannah like wildfire. Within hours, it was on every cell phone, in messaging groups, on local blogs, and even in Atlanta news outlets. What was supposed to be a celebration of the union between Ethan Hollis and Blair Whitcomb turned into a spectacle of public cruelty. The footage clearly showed Ethan thanking his ex-wife for being a failed rehearsal. The reaction was immediate. Some laughed at the sarcasm, but many others condemned the cruelty of exposing a woman in such a way in front of so many. Ethan's reputation, previously seen as a stylish and confident heir, began to be tarnished, and Blair's found herself dragged along, an accomplice in a scene that had spiraled completely out of control. In the glass-enclosed office at Hollis Maritime Headquarters, press officers struggled to contain the crisis. The phone rang non-stop, with reporters demanding official statements. Blair, in shock, ran nervous hands through her hair, while her mother, a buckhead socialite, screamed that this was the kind of situation that could ruin reputations built over decades. Ethan, for his part, tried to feign calm, but his restless gaze betrayed the approaching storm. Meanwhile, across town, in a modest house in the Starland district, Maya remained silent. She hadn't given any interviews, hadn't responded to the dozens of messages she'd received. The only person she'd spoken to was her lawyer and friend, Aidan Nguyen, who had already explained the weight of the court summons. The addendum to Leon Hollis's will wasn't common. Such documents only appeared in extreme cases when the deceased wished to conceal part of their will until a specific condition was met. For Ada, the fact that Leon had mentioned Maya was proof that there was much more to the story than anyone imagined. Rumors were mounting. Some believed Leon had left assets to Maya as a gesture of compassion. Others said the patriarch might be acting against his own son, with whom he had clashed several times in recent years. The truth was, no one knew for sure the document's contents, and this uncertainty was gnawing at the backs of Savannah's elite. The company's restless shareholders called non-stop, demanding explanations that not even the lawyers had yet. At the Whitcomb mansion, Blair and her mother devised a strategy of attack. They believed Maya could not, under any circumstances, escape her position as a humiliated victim. Any possibility of advancement had to be stifled quickly. Ethan, however, under pressure from all sides, realized he needed to act quickly. He gathered lawyers, consultants, and family members around a mahogany table and, tapping his fingers impatiently, made it clear, "This won't change anything. Maya will have no power over me or the company. We will crush any suggestion that she has any rights." But even his words rang hollow in the face of the growing uncertainty. While the Hollises and Whitcombs despaired in closed-door meetings, Maya walked alone along the riverfront, reflecting on everything that was happening. She remembered her conversations with Leon, how he treated her, as someone capable of upholding the truth in a world of masks. She wasn't seeking revenge. Inside her was only a mixture of pain and exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't ignore the summons. Whatever was written in that document would be read in front of everyone, and it would be up to her to face whatever came. The night before the hearing, the town seemed on edge. Newspapers reported speculation, social media was abuzz with theories, and everyone Maya crossed paths seemed to watch her with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Some neighbors offered words of support, others stayed away, fearful of becoming embroiled in something that seemed bigger than everyone else. Inside, Maya opened an old box she kept in the closet. Inside, Leon's handwritten notes of advice, small notes about courage and never letting herself be crushed by the weight of others, were hidden. She read them silently, feeling the old patriarch's voice echo like a guide through that night of uncertainty. The next morning, the streets of Savannah dawned, with journalists stationed outside the courthouse. Cameras, flashes, and microphones multiplied by the minute. The city center seemed to be experiencing an unprecedented spectacle, as if the trial of an entire family were also the trial of the morals of an entire community. Maya stepped out of the car with firm steps, even feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. The reporters' shouts echoed, but she didn't respond. She simply walked toward the entrance, aware that every second from then on would be scrutinized by the entire city. This was the beginning of a conflict that would change not only the lives of those involved, but the very perception of power in Savannah. A marriage turned into a scandal, a secret will, and an underestimated ex-wife who, against all odds, was called center stage. What would come next, no one could have predicted. The initial reactions to the will's addendum echoed like thunder in a city accustomed to secrecy. In the hallways of the Whitcomb mansion, Blair locked herself in her room and wept with rage, while her furious mother called Atlanta columnists trying to control the narrative. For them, the mere mention of Maya was an affront, but the possibility that her name might carry any real weight within the Hollis empire was intolerable. The fear was not just of scandal, but of the loss of prestige that could affect generations of carefully built social influence. On the business side, Hollis Maritime's board of directors collapsed. Lawyers met in emergency conferences, trying to predict the document's contents. Some were already admitting in private conversations that if Maya were indeed benefited, it would have direct implications for the company's control. The stock market reacted negatively, with rumors of a share price drop, and New York shareholders pressed for answers. The empire, which had seemed solid, was beginning to shake because of a single woman previously considered irrelevant. While the powerful were agitated, the port workers remembered another Maya. To them, she wasn't the humiliated ex-wife, but the young woman who appeared in the wee hours of the morning with hot coffee and kind words. The longshoreman commented that, while still married to Ethan, Maya made a point of visiting the warehouses and listening to the stories of those who carried the real weight of the company. Among them, a sense of hope arose that perhaps something was about to change, that this simple woman could somehow represent a leadership closer to their reality. In the small house in the Starland district, Maya and Ada analyzed every detail of the notes Leon had left. Among the advice and notes, there was one sentence that stood out: "If the truth is stifled, it will find its own way to breathe." It was impossible not to see it as a premonition. Ada, more pragmatic, insisted that her friend be prepared for any revelation, including becoming the target of even more violent attacks. Maya, however, simply took a deep breath and tried to remain calm, knowing that her life could change at any moment. Meanwhile, at dinners attended by the local elite, Maya's name was the main topic. Some predicted she would receive only a symbolic sum, while others bet Leon was playing a secret strategy to protect the company from within. The suspense fueled conversations, bets, and intrigue. All of Savannah seemed to live for what would be revealed. The historic facades and immaculate gardens hid a city in turmoil, where everyone wondered whose side they would be on when the truth came out. These initial reactions showed that the conflict was no longer just between Ethan and Maya. The entire town was involved, as if the fate of an entire community depended on the reading of a few pages of paper. Maya, still silent, became the center of gravity of a plot that was beyond her control, but which somehow always seemed to have been written for her. Inside the car, parked in front of the probate court, Maya looked at herself in the rearview mirror and for a few seconds didn't recognize herself. The face reflected looked like a stranger's, someone bearing invisible scars from battles she'd never chosen to fight. There was a mix of anxiety and sadness in her eyes, but also a subtle gleam of resilience. As she took a deep breath, flashes of her past returned like waves, memories of a life that had begun with promise and ended in wounds. She remembered the first nights with Ethan, when she still believed love could overcome social barriers. She remembered how he made her laugh on walks along the riverfront and the lazy mornings on Tybee Island when she believed the future would be bright. These memories, once sweet, now had a bittersweet aftertaste. With every happy memory came the memory of contempt, of the nights Ethan would arrive late without explanation, of the silent dinners where the distance grew like an invisible wall. The weight of the humiliation at the altar still burned like an open wound. It wasn't just the cruelty of Ethan's words, but the feeling that the entire city had witnessed her suffering. She knew the scene had already been broadcast on video, that thousands of eyes saw her as the betrayed and exposed woman. This pain, however, wasn't limited to shame. It was also the pain of realizing that, no matter how much she had given herself to the marriage, she had been reduced to a caricature before a society that had never truly accepted her. In the silence of the car, Maya remembered the countless times she'd swallowed her words to protect Ethan, the way she'd defended his reputation, even when she knew she was being unfair to herself. She remembered how she'd accepted being the shield against scandal, the convenient shadow where mistakes and omissions hid. The injustice wasn't just the suffering she'd suffered, but the fact that she'd been used as a disposable pawn in a game she'd never chosen to play. The surrounding streets of Savannah teemed with journalists and onlookers, but to Maya it all seemed distant. The real turmoil was within her. The feeling of isolation, of being judged without the right to a defense, corroded her spirit. Yet amid the pain, there was an insistent flame that refused to be extinguished. The same flame Ethan Hollis had recognized in her one day, when he told her there was more power in her silence than in all the empty speeches he usually heard in the salons of the elite. As she straightened her coat and prepared to leave, Maya closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't seek courage in revenge, but in something deeper, the desire not to be crushed. She had learned that pain could be transformed into fuel, that tears could become seeds of resistance. When she opened her eyes again, she didn't just see her humiliated ex-wife. She saw someone ready to face the weight of the Hollis name, not out of pride, but because there was no turning back. Her past was tattooed in every invisible scar, and that was precisely what made her capable of taking the next step. The hearing had barely begun when Maya realized that amid the tension, she needed to adopt a different stance. It wouldn't be the wounded woman everyone expected. It would be the strategic silence that disturbs more than any speech. When Judge Lila McPherson announced a brief recess before the full reading of the addendum, Maya touched the arm of her attorney, Ada Nguyen, and the two left the building without attracting attention. Their destination was a low zinc shed in the terminal, identified by a faded label, Bay 12. The key Leon had left among the notes stored in the old box fitted firmly into the rusty padlock. The metallic click sounded like a secret unlocking. Inside were cardboard boxes lined by decade, folders catalogued with the patriarch's obsessive method, and, on top of them all, a manila envelope bearing his unmistakable handwriting. Ada carefully broke the seal. They contained internal memos, shareholder agreements, corporate ethics opinions, and a string of short, handwritten notes, reminders about conduct, dignity, and moral triggers that seemed to point to something greater than mere legal formalities. At the back, inside a small tin can, was a flash drive identified only with the initials L.H. Maya held the flash drive like someone receiving an invisible inheritance. Ada opened her laptop on the hood of the car, plugged in the device, and the screen showed Ethan Hollis in his dark wood office, light streaming through the blinds. His voice was deep and unhurried. "If this message is being seen, it's because the truth needed help. Hollis Maritime was built with the sweat of people no one applauds. Anyone who confuses legacy with vanity has misunderstood me. I trust you because you know what it's like to be looked down upon and still stand tall. Protect what matters, the dignity of those who keep this port breathing." The impact of that recording was greater than any clause. For Ada, it was a piece of legal and symbolic value capable of supporting difficult decisions. For Maya, it was an acknowledgement that glued back together parts of herself that had been broken. Leon wasn't talking about punishment, but about responsibility. He wasn't asking for revenge, he was asking for decency. And for the first time since the church scene, Maya felt like she was breathing without carrying the entire city on her chest. They decided to keep everything secret for now. The plan wasn't to attack publicly, but rather to wait for the right moment, to reveal enough in the right way. In Savannah, Maya had learned that it's not shouting that breaks down walls, but the patience of those who know where the first crack is. They photographed the essential documents, put away the envelope, and returned to the courthouse in silence, the salt of the river still in the air. When Maya re-entered the courtroom, something about her had changed. Her dress remained simple, her hair tied back with the same practicality, but there was a firmness in her shoulders, a poise in her eyes, a calm that hadn't been there this morning. Ethan noticed it immediately. His posture swayed for a second. His fingers touched the table as if searching for soil. He didn't know about Bay 12 or the video, but he recognized that kind of silence, the silence of someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. The judge resumed the session. Lawyers arranged. In papers, photographers controlled the flashbulbs. Maya sat down unhurriedly and folded her hands, and in that gesture, the silent turnaround was complete. There was no announcement, no catchphrase, no applauding audience. There was only the intimate certainty that when the time came, she would have more than just grievances to present. She would have facts. She would have the patriarch's word. She would have the courage that grows when one tires of asking permission. Ethan, 6 feet away, felt something he wasn't used to, the very real possibility of losing control. He looked at Blair, who avoided his gaze, and understood that the narrative that had begun as a spectacle of humiliation could end as a lesson. Maya didn't need to defeat him out loud. She just needed to remain standing when the weight fell, and that was exactly what she was about to do. The session resumed with a thick silence, as if the room needed to relearn how to breathe. Judge Lila McPherson adjusted her glasses, confirmed attendance, and asked everyone to be seated. Instead of going straight to the sealed addendum, she opened the main body of the will. The first provisions were predictable: scholarships for Georgia State University, donations to the Savannah Children's Hospital, funds for Bonaventure Cemetery and historic churches. Then came the business provisions. Lila read, in a neutral tone, the maintenance of the controlling trust, the board succession mechanism, and the distribution of dividends. She put down the sheet of paper, took a deep breath, and announced an instrument drafted months after the will: the Conduct and Continuity Clause. It wasn't an embellishment, it was a mechanism that tied power to behavior. The clause had 2 parts, a preamble and operative articles. In the preamble, written in his own hand, Leon stated that Hollis Maritime would only survive if it remembered its keepers, anonymous workers, and that public conduct that violated the dignity of a person he considered essential would trigger temporary protection mechanisms. It was his way of saying that reputation is not a showcase, it's a foundation. The articles were numbered. Article 1 defined public vexatious exposure as acts or statements made by direct beneficiaries in open settings or with widespread repercussion that subjected the protected person to ridicule. Article 2 established a sensitive period of 12 months after divorce. Article 3 provided for the immediate suspension of the violators' voting rights, transferring them for a fixed period to an interim trustee. Article 4 described safeguards, independent audit, accounting, and automatic reversal at the end of the term if there were no new violations. Article 5 conditioned the selection of the trustee on a nominative sealed annex to be opened only if the court prima facie admitted that the trigger had occurred. The Hollis' lawyer questioned the vagueness of humiliation and embarrassment, asking for time. Lila examined the records and pointed to recently filed material: the cathedral video, news reports, screenshots, and the subpoena served during the ceremony. She stated that there was sufficient evidence to recognize, in a preliminary analysis, the possibility of legal action. The murmur grew. Blair crossed her arms. Ethan clenched his jaw. Maya remained silent. There was no satisfaction, only focus. She knew what she kept outside, but she didn't need it right now. Leon's logic held its own. He wasn't talking about resentment, but about boundaries. And the boundaries had become lines with leverage. Lila moved on to the appendices. She reported that there was Appendix A, with interpretative notes, and Appendix B, sealed and nominative. From Appendix A, she read objective parameters: public presence, purpose of the act, impact on reputation, repetition of conduct, and the possibility of mitigating factors through unequivocal retraction. Appendix B could only be opened if the hypothesis were, in theory, established. The lawyer insisted on postponing the matter. The judge authorized a parallel expert evaluation, but denied the postponement. She ordered Appendix B to be opened. A servant brought the manila envelope with crimson ribbons. The room held its breath. Lila positioned the document, ran her fingers over the seal, and before breaking it read Leon's opening clause. "The interim trustee shall be the person I have indicated in Exhibit B, the proper guardian of the dignity that has been injured." She broke the seal. Her eyes followed the movement of the paper. As Lila began to slide the inner page open, the sound of the courtroom faded to a distant hum. She looked up and prepared her voice to pronounce the first name. The announcement of Exhibit B fell upon the courtroom like a bolt of lightning. Judge Lila McPherson lifted the sheet of paper and clearly pronounced the name written there: Maya Reed. For a second, no one reacted. The air seemed to still, and then suddenly the courtroom erupted in voices, shouts, protests. Blair clapped her hand over her mouth in disbelief, while Ethan stood abruptly, his face furious. The Hollis family's lawyers rushed to file objections, while reporters rushed to report the news. The impossible had happened. The ex-wife, humiliated at the altar, was now, by the patriarch's will, the temporary guardian of power. The shock reverberated first within the family itself. Ethan's mother, Eleanor, collapsed in her chair as if she'd lost her footing. Cousins and uncles murmured indignantly among themselves, alleging manipulation or madness on the part of the deceased. Ethan pounded his fists on the table, demanding that the decision be declared invalid. The judge, serene, reminded her that she was merely following the law. The document was legitimate, had been filed, and it was up to her to execute it. Impassioned voices echoed throughout the courtroom, but none could drown out the fact. Leon Hollis had chosen Maya, and nothing could change that immediately. At the Whitcomb mansion, the atmosphere was warlike. Blair's mother was screaming on the phone at press officers, demanding that the narrative be reversed. "We cannot allow this woman to be seen as a winner," she said, sobbing with rage. Blair, pale, watched her public image crumble. The marriage that was supposed to cement her power had become an international scandal. Columnists in Atlanta and New York were already running the headline, "Ex-wife assumes power in billion-dollar empire after public humiliation." Blair's name, once associated with glamour and prestige, was now linked to the word failure. At the port, workers celebrated quietly. Some raised cups of coffee, others texted each other applause emojis. To them, Maya wasn't just a name on a piece of paper, but someone who knew their faces, who had heard their stories. The idea of seeing her with real power felt like unexpected justice. The dock corridors echoed with hopeful murmurs. "Maybe now the company will look at us." Behind the scenes, the shock was even greater. Hollis Maritime shares fluctuated wildly in New York. Investors demanded emergency meetings. Analysts tried to interpret the impact of the clause. Some saw Maya as a threat, others saw her as a potential moral stabilization that could bring credibility. Either way, uncertainty dominated the reports. Never before had a name so divided opinions in such a short period of time. Ethan, however, wouldn't accept it. Standing, breathing heavily, he shouted that this was a farce, that Maya had manipulated his father. The judge, firm, warned him of contempt. "Control yourself, Mr. Hollis, or you will be removed from this room." The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the sound of pens recording the minutes. Ethan sat, but his eyes burned with anger. Blair, beside him, held his hand half-heartedly. Their union, once portrayed as perfect, was already showing visible cracks. Maya, however, remained silent. She didn't raise her voice, didn't smile, didn't celebrate. Her eyes were fixed on the judge, as if each word were a weight she accepted to bear. The shock of her family and enemies surrounded her, but instead of weakening her, it seemed to strengthen her. What had begun as humiliation turned into a reversal of power no one could have predicted. The clause's confirmation immediately shifted the balance of power within Hollis Maritime. Judge McPherson ruled that, until the audit was completed and the legal deadline expired, Ethan's voting rights would be suspended and transferred to Maya Reed, now recognized as interim trustee. The decision fell upon the courtroom like a slam dunk. Ethan paled, Blair clenched her fists, and the lawyers scrambled to file record-breaking appeals. But the fact was inescapable. Power, albeit temporary, had changed hands. The next morning, Maya was driven in a discreet car to the company's headquarters, a glass building reflecting the port, cranes in the background. As she walked through the reception area, curious and surprised glances followed her. Some employees stood discreetly as a sign of respect. Others whispered in disbelief. They never imagined that this woman, so often ignored at galas, would enter with regal authority. Maya kept her expression firm, even though the pressure inside was overwhelming. In the main meeting room, the board members were already waiting for her. A mahogany table gleamed under the artificial lighting, surrounded by men and women accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions. The looks on their faces were a mixture of disdain and caution. The interim chairman opened the session by explaining that according to the court order, Maya now had the deciding vote in the event of a tie. It was a technicality, but in practical terms, it placed her at the center of all the deliberations. Maya took a deep breath before speaking. Her words were few, measured, but firm. She wasn't seeking confrontation, only compliance with Leon Hollis's wishes. She reinforced that she was there to preserve the company's legacy and ensure that dignity guided every decision. The silence that followed her words was revealing. Some board members looked away, others hurriedly jotted notes, but everyone understood that this was not the same woman humiliated before the altar. Outside, the press followed every move. Newscasts broadcast footage of Maya entering the building, and commentators debated the impact of the clause. While some called her an unexpected hero, others accused her of opportunism. But amid the noise, the truth remained. Power had changed hands, and Ethan Hollis was, for the first time, out of command. At the port, workers followed the story on a bar's television. Maya's every gesture was celebrated as if it were a victory of their own. For them, the political game didn't matter, but the fact that someone who knew their hardships was sitting at the table where decisions were made. The confidence in the patriarch's words seemed, at last, to find a real echo. Ethan, meanwhile, isolated in his mansion, felt defeat corrode every fiber of his pride. Accustomed to being in charge, he now had to watch from afar as Maya occupied the space she considered rightfully hers. The power that had always seemed unshakable had slipped from his grasp like sand. It was a reversal he would never forgive. The extraordinary council was convened 2 days later, and the press surrounded the building as if it were the stage for a sports final. Maya entered accompanied by Ada, her lawyer, and walked down the corridor lined with cameras and flashes. With every step, she was reminded that she had been seen as a shadow, but now she was the central figure. The atmosphere was hostile. Councillors murmured, journalists shouted questions, and even some staffers seemed to doubt her legitimacy to be there. The tension reached a peak when Ethan appeared, impeccably suited and with a fiery gaze, trying to regain authority with his posture. But the silence that followed Maya's entrance showed that the narrative was no longer his. The meeting began with technical reports, numbers projected on screens, and cold debates about contracts. But the real scene unfolded when Maya took the floor. She stood up, looked around, and spoke about the video found in Bay 12, in which Leon, in his own voice, explained why he had written the clause. The patriarch's words were played on audio, echoing in a room. I trust only those who know the pain of exclusion. Power without empathy is ruin. The impact was immediate. Councillors who had previously remained indifferent shifted in their chairs. The shadow of doubt about Maya began to give way to an involuntary respect. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, accusing her of manipulation, calling the video faked. But Ada presented the expert testimony authenticating the recording, and the room fell into an awkward silence. It was the first Time the heir, accustomed to controlling everything with shouts, found himself disarmed in the face of incontrovertible evidence. In that moment, the humiliation had changed target. The man who had exposed his ex-wife in public was now exposed by his own father's voice. The scene took on even more symbolic tones when Maya, without raising her voice, said, "I'm not here to destroy, but to remember what has been forgotten. This company is not a stage for vanity, but the livelihood of thousands of families." Each word carried calm firmness. There was no theatrics, only conviction. It was enough to shift the room's gaze. From humiliated victim, she had become the bearer of moral authority. Outside, the news spread in real time. Television networks interrupted broadcasts to show excerpts of Maya's speech. On the streets of Savannah, bars and coffee shops broadcast live, and workers cheered with every sentence. The audience, which days before had witnessed the humiliation at the altar, now saw their ex-wife occupy the space that had previously seemed unreachable. The humiliation had been reversed, and Ethan, who had exited the cathedral proudly, left the council with slumped shoulders, pursued by cameras capturing every detail of his defeat. That day, it wasn't numbers or strategies that changed the game, but the quiet strength of a woman who had learned to transform pain into dignity. The public humiliation was turned against the aggressor, and the entire city understood that the story had just changed protagonists. That night, Maya returned home exhausted. The weight of the past few days seemed to have settled on her shoulders, but something was different. For the first time, she felt like she was no longer a spectator in her own story. However, the dilemma that loomed ahead didn't just involve paperwork, advice, or legal clauses. It was an intimate choice, one that touched her very core: to forgive or to seek revenge. As he lay there, old memories came flooding back. Ethan's voice echoed, calling her a failure at private parties, ridiculing her origins. The silent tears she had swallowed so many times resurfaced like invisible scars. The humiliation at the altar still throbbed like an open wound, and behind it all was the image of the faces that had mocked her, the whispers of an entire city. The desire for revenge, to return the pain in kind, was real, pulsing through her veins. But there was also another memory: Ethan Hollis, sitting in his leather chair, saying in a firm voice that power without compassion was ruin. She remembered the gleam in his eyes when he spoke of dignity, of the difference between commanding respect and inspiring it. Those words echoed now as if the old patriarch was still there, demanding a decision. The next morning, Ethan came looking for her. He showed up at her door, unannounced, his face drawn, his eyes red with anger and exhaustion. The arrogance was still there, but mixed with something new: fear. "Do you think you won?" he said, his voice trembling. Maya didn't respond immediately. She just watched him, remembering every insult, every heavy silence, every night he'd made her feel invisible. She could destroy him with a single word. She could expose him even further, drag him down into the mud. But she could also let him live with his own weight, condemned to carry the image of defeat before everyone. The conversation was short, almost cold. Ethan pleaded covertly, saying that the company was rightfully his, that Maya was nothing more than a pawn used by her old father. She simply listened to him silently, as if she could no longer be affected. Before leaving, Ethan looked her in the eye and murmured, "It doesn't end here." And in that moment, Maya understood that whatever decision she made, to forgive or to take revenge, would shape not only his future, but her own. At the council, advisors and lawyers anxiously awaited her decision. She could toughen up, push Ethan away for good, and consolidate her temporary power into something permanent. Or she could choose an unexpected path, not submission, but public forgiveness, capable of transforming her not only into a leader, but also into a symbol of something greater. The tension was unbearable. Maya took a deep breath, and with the same serenity she had demonstrated until then, made it clear that she would not use her power personally. But neither would she let any attempt to repeat the humiliation go unpunished. It was a fine but powerful line: forgiveness as a gesture, firmness as a shield. The town watched everything in real time. Some applauded her stance, others criticized, saying she should crush Ethan mercilessly. But for Maya, the choice was clear. A might give her immediate pleasure, but forgiveness would give her freedom. And by choosing to no longer carry the burden of anger, she understood she had won on a level Ethan would never understand. The Savannah courthouse was packed again on the morning the final decision on the clause was to be finalized. Reporters crowded at the doors and cameras broadcast live nationwide. The Hollis case was no longer just a family dispute. It had become a symbol of a larger clash between pride and dignity. Maya strode in, surrounded by watchful eyes, while Ethan emerged shortly after, pale and tense, accompanied by Blair and a row of lawyers. The tension was palpable, as if the air had thickened in the room. Judge Lila McPherson opened the session by reminding them of the terms of the clause. She reiterated that after analyzing the evidence, the alter video, the public outcry, the impact on Maya's image, there was more than enough evidence to trigger the suspension of Ethan's rights. With each word, the heir clenched his fists, and Blair looked away. When the independent audit report was read, confirming irregularities in Ethan's public conduct and validating the clause, their fate seemed sealed. It was then that Ethan, breaking protocol, suddenly stood up. His voice echoed in the hall. "This is a conspiracy. My father was manipulated. Maya never belonged to this family." The judge warned him, but he continued, shouting until two officers approached. Blair tried to calm him down, but the scene was already recorded by dozens of cameras. The man who had tried to humiliate his ex-wife was now struggling in front of a national audience. The image of power he had cultivated for years was crumbling there, in real time. Maya, for her part, remained silent. She didn't need to respond. Ethan's own behavior was her most eloquent indictment. When he was finally restrained and forced to sit, the judge continued. She firmly declared that Maya Reed would maintain interim control of the Hollis maritime vote until the end of the allotted term. The decision was met with shock and muffled applause. The town, which had previously laughed at her, now witnessed her rise. But the climax wasn't just the court ruling. After the hearing, Maya walked to the courthouse steps, where dozens of microphones stood waiting. For a few seconds, she hesitated. She knew every word would be analyzed, repeated, recorded forever. And then she spoke, her voice clear and firm. "This isn't about revenge. This is about respect. Leon's legacy isn't made of titles, but of people. And as long as I hold this responsibility, it will be used to protect, not humiliate." The words echoed through the streets, broadcast live. Journalists applauded, workers raised their fists, and even critics acknowledged that something had changed. The narrative was no longer about Ethan and his downfall, but about Maya and her quiet victory. In that moment, all of Savannah understood that the story had reached its climax. The man who had used the altar to destroy himself had destroyed himself before the cameras, and the woman who had been reduced to a failed rehearsal was now the guardian of the legacy. The climax of the story was not a cry of triumph, but the serenity of someone who had finally earned the right to be heard. With the verdict solidified and the climax already experienced, the city of Savannah seemed to breathe a different air. The streets, once filled with whispers and innuendo, now echoed with conversations about justice, dignity, and change. Maya Reed walked the sidewalks like someone who had walked through a fire and, instead of ashes, brought with her new roots. She wasn't just the interim guardian of Hollis Maritime. She had become a symbol of resistance in a city accustomed to bowing to the powerful. The Hollis case, which had begun as a spectacle of public humiliation, ended as a collective learning experience. Those who had laughed at Maya were now forced to rethink their judgments. Business councils began to discuss ethics more seriously. Gossip columnists wrote about empathy among elites, and port workers finally felt their voices resonate in the marble halls. The impact went beyond the legal or familial sphere. It was cultural. It was moral. Ethan, reduced to the shadow of his former self, retreated into silence. His allies gradually abandoned him, fearing that his closeness would drag them even further down. The arrogance that had once been his shield was now his prison. The image of a haughty heir had crumbled, replaced by that of a man defeated by his own temper. Blair, for her part, quietly withdrew, seeking to preserve what little prestige she had left. The marriage that would have been the pinnacle of her social life became a public scar. Maya, however, didn't celebrate anyone's downfall. Her victories were quiet, almost intimate. She preferred to focus on work, meetings, and the social causes Leon valued. With every decision, she remembered his words, "Power without empathy is ruin." And so, albeit temporarily, he ruled not with an iron fist, but with a calm firmness that inspired confidence. In the city, young people began using her name as an example in school speeches. Small local businesses began citing Maya as an inspiration for courage. Even those who had previously rejected her at parties began greeting her on the streets, some with embarrassment, others with sincere admiration. Time showed that her true victory lay not in the clause or the position, but in the respect she had earned. When the term of interim guardianship ended, Maya relinquished the rights that had been entrusted to her. She didn't try to prolong her power, nor did she seek to transform the exception into the rule. This gesture surprised everyone. It showed that her fight had never been for the throne, but for the restoration of dignity. By stepping aside, she left behind not a void, but an example. That power is greater when used as a service, not as a weapon. The moral of the story rang like a bell. Humiliation may seem like victory in the moment, but life exacts its price. Dignity, on the other hand, flourishes even under the rocks. Maya Reed, once exposed as a failure before everyone, had become a living reminder that no one can erase the strength of those who remain standing. And as Savannah went about her daily routine, people whispered a lesson they would never forget. It is not power that defines someone's greatness, but how it is used.